Hello, everyone, and welcome to Maritime Matters with Eric Dawicki, president of the Northeast Maritime Institute. This is a brand new radio program we know you'll enjoy that will discuss maritime history, culture, and the industry issues of today and tomorrow, linked right here to our own home on the South Coast. Eric, what a delight, a real pleasure to be with you, and especially with this new radio program.
Phil, I couldn't be more excited to really have an opportunity to talk about the maritime industry and bringing it back to the forefront of the South Coast because, again, we've played such a vital role in who we have been, who we can be to the maritime industry. And gosh, what an exciting time.
Exciting underscores the tone of today's program. Folks, if you love history, remember that Believe It or Not, or things of that nature where you'd read something and go, oh my goodness, I didn't realize that. You are going to get so much great information today about the history, the important, vital history of our area and its link to the maritime industry and how, well, we'll just let you describe how important it is. Not only interesting, folks, but also vitally important. Eric Dawicki is going to be with us every week here on WBSM as the host of this new program. And what do you hope to accomplish by it?
I really hope to accomplish the idea of reintroducing the vital role and the importance of the maritime industry and how it can provide for our community. It certainly has in the past. It certainly is currently. But there are still people that need access to employment. There are still industries that need polishing up. And my belief is if somebody else can, why can't we?
Great. I mean that. That is so interesting. Folks, how important it is that we have an area that makes close to $1 billion each and every year. Revenue generated from maritime businesses. How very important it is to have a radio program that is dedicated and honors the maritime industries that truly do matter. On today's program, we're going to offer you some very interesting tidbits of information that are not only interesting, but also vitally important. And Eric, where does one start when you look at the rich history of the port of New Bedford? Where does one start historically describing its importance?
Phil, that's a tough one. But I'll tell you, it really, we have written history, of course, from the Europeans, but I'm sure the Wampanoags played a vital role in establishing fishing grounds and cultivating food, shellfish. We know with the Wampanoags, wampum became the coinage of the day, and that's that bright, vital little purple color that we find on the quahog shell. And the reality is our maritimes in this area did establish itself as a way for our communities, right from the indigenous people to the European settlers. And that's something that's fascinating to explore and looking at how we began as a community, but how we evolved as a community, how we may have sputtered as a community, and what opportunities might exist in the future.
I know it's been said before, Eric, but it is the oldest industry in all of America. And, when we look at our American history, what is more important than to honor just that one fact?
Well, I will tell you, we are the South Coast. We are New Bedford, Fairhaven, where so much history has been expanded, not only locally, but throughout other nations. That to ignore this is probably not in the cards.
Right.
And I think what we need to do is learn from our history, learn from our culture, and really develop a formula as a way forward for our community and establish new history.
Mm-hmm. Folks, you're going to learn so much in today's program. I think that it's incumbent upon many of you listening to turn up the volume, because you're going to love listening to what Eric has to tell us about. Well, let's talk about New Bedford and how it was discovered, when it was discovered, and we think about Plymouth, but what about New Bedford?
Well, the funny part is the second community established by the Pilgrims was the Oxford community, which was right here in North Fairhaven on the Acushnet River.
Really?
So you look at that, and then you start to look at the history of New Bedford as it was recorded by the English. It truly began 4 centuries ago, and in fact predates the Pilgrims by about 18 years.
I had no idea. It predates the Pilgrims.
It does. It really occurred when Bartholomew Gosnold investigated New Bedford's harbor on May 31st of 1602. Gosnold's expedition set out from Falmouth, England, and was financed in part by the Earl of Southampton, a patron of Shakespeare, in fact. Gosnold named Cape Cod for the abundance of fish that he observed. He named the vineyard Martha's Vineyard after his beloved daughter, Martha, and named the Elizabeth Islands after Queen Elizabeth I. So that all occurred in 1602, but he noticed something interesting in the sense that he found a mainland with some smoky rocks, and which in fact was New Bedford. It was the outcropping of rocks that existed a little bit northwest of Palmer's Island, which is now the site of the South Terminal. It's pretty fascinating.
It is fascinating. Wow. And now that I know how Cape Cod got its name, I didn't know that. I'm sure that many listeners are going to say the same thing. This is very important to our local history. Tell us more.
Well, you think about the codfish industry. And certainly Cape Cod had its abundance with the rich nutrient waters of George's Banks. Not only did we supply our own cod industry to the Americas, but soon thereafter, within about 100 years, the rest of the world figured out how rich our waters were with codfish and started to come here and extract the fish from our waters, and to the point where it's actually adversely affected us. But we see some recovery, which is good, with fish management stocks and some dialogue between the fishing industry and the National Marine Fisheries, which has been a positive step forward as of late. But our codfish industry really was the first maritime industry to establish itself in the Americas, and we were lucky enough to host it right here in the greater or South Coast area, the greater New Bedford area.
I'm going to depend on your expertise, Eric. If this kind of, what I would call poaching was happening hundreds of years ago with others coming up, does it still happen nowadays that other nations will come and take what, could be considered our own?
Well, nowadays there are regional multilateral agreements and quotas that you'll have multiple nations engaged in a quota system. They will monitor vessels with monitoring systems, long-range satellite tracking, what's called automatic identification systems, which is a radio wave identification system for vessels to be monitored remotely. But the realities are we only have a 200-mile limit, so people can't come in and fish within those 200 miles unless they belong into those regional agreements. That doesn't really occur too much. Canada's done a pretty outstanding job of keeping the foreign poachers out. The These were often the Eastern European nations years ago, back in the 70s, if you recall. Really, the Russians were facilitating much of their protein intake through the fisheries industries.
Right.
So, that has softened off over the last 10 years or so, maybe a little bit more, but we're starting to manage those fisheries a little bit better, finally utilizing not only science, but the knowledge of the people who actually plied the seas and actually fished those waters to understand some how the industry evolved or devolved and how it can be recovered.
Folks, we are talking about the history, maritime history of our area. We just found out that New Bedford is, 18 years before Plymouth. That is something I never knew. And all the years I've been here, I just discovered that thanks to your knowledge, Eric. What about Fairhaven? Give us a sense of its role in history and when it was incorporated.
Well, I don't have the dates that Fairhaven was incorporated, but I'll tell you the role that Fairhaven played in its maritime culture. Actually, I do have the dates. It was 1812, which is a fascinating year in itself because not only did Fairhaven establish itself as a fishing community along with its neighboring community of New Bedford, it was part of New Bedford, and it was part of Old Dartmouth. And, we split up and created our own townships, but the year 1812 is pretty significant out of Fairhaven because there was this War of 1812 that
I remember reading about that.
This one battleship called the Nimrod from the United Kingdom came around and started burning all of our East Coast communities. And a little group of militiamen from Fairhaven chased down the Nimrod in 1812 and scuttled it off of Cuttyhunk. And in fact, I'm pretty proud to be in charge of the institute that hosts one of the cannons from the HMS Nimrod. Northeast Maritime Institute has one of the cannons from the Nimrod that was discovered about 10 years ago, and we keep it in a brine, a bath, to keep it from falling apart. But anybody can come see that cannon in the front foyer of Northeast Maritime Institute. And that's a pretty neat piece of history. But Fairhaven also played a great history in the sense that the first person to ever circumnavigate the world alone left from Fairhaven on the Spray, a little boat called the Spray, and his name was Joshua Slocum. And Joshua Slocum was one talented individual because he would take these vessels and go around the world, originally in the commercial trade, and when he retired, he decided to travel around the world and write about it alone. And he did that from Fairhaven, which is really quite a remarkable feat. And again, to talk about the Institute, we host the Joshua Slocum International Society Library at the Institute. So the members of the Slocum International Society donate their books, their maritime and cruising books to the Institute. We host them. We're part of the MassCat library system, so you can be part of any library in the state and reach out into that Slocum library at Northeast Maritime Institute and get books delivered to your library about anything maritime. And it's a very significant, I should say, asset to our community. And it was all based on the drive and vision of Joshua Slocum of having the courage to travel around the world, sail around the world alone.
About when? About when was this?
Oh, it was probably in the 1870s to 1910 area. But it was kind of the falling off of the great tall ships that were actually trading in sailing around the world delivering cargoes. When the introduction of steam came in, that's when he started to, disappear from the industry as a commercial operator, and probably got a little bit sympathetic to canvas, and decided in his retirement, being home ashore wasn't so fun, so he took to adventure. But what he truly delivered was a great book called Sailing Around the World Alone, which really introduces the concept of geography, the concept of trade. And it's just a fascinating thing that we played host to such a great gift to the world,
Sure.
and to really talk about what it is all about, going to sea, meeting different cultures, meeting different peoples. And then, of course, Fairhaven played host to the vessel that Herman Melville left from. And that was the Acushnet, which was a Fairhaven hosted vessel. And when Melville went around the world whaling, it inspired the book Moby Dick. And eventually, Moby Dick has become one of the most famous books worldwide. I travel all over the world, and when people ask me, "Where are you from?" I say, "New Bedford." And Moby Dick, exactly right. That's exactly correct. And it's really fascinating how we can connect New Bedford to the rest of the world through this great era of whaling.
Folks, I just told you a few minutes ago that you'd be interested in hearing Eric Dawicki, and I just heard a collective, "Oh, that was interesting." Eric is the host of Maritime Matters, also the president of Northeast Maritime Institute. And this is going to be a new radio program we know you're going to enjoy listening to, because not only will it discuss, as we are today, maritime history, but also maritime culture and industry issues of today and tomorrow that are linked to the South Coast. And we are really very honored to have you. It's going to be a terrific venture and a great idea for a radio show. I have never, in all of my years in broadcasting, have heard of anything with this concept. Good for you, Eric.
Well, I'm honored to be here, certainly, and really humbled to have been just a kid from East Fairhaven and exposed to an industry that brought me around the world and really gave me an education that, honestly, I couldn't have received in a classroom. I'm proud of my experience and really, truly blessed. I jokingly tell everybody that God takes care of fools and sailors, and I'm doubly blessed.
So when was the time that the first wave jumped out and grabbed you? When did your interest in this really embrace you? How far back does that go?
Phil, to be honest, I was born into it. I would sit at the dinner table as a child, as a baby, as an infant, as a toddler, listening to the stories that my father told. He traveled all around the world. But the true inspiration came from my grandfather, Dawicki, who just loved his seagoing career. And he quite honestly didn't have to do it. He had enough money in the bank to not have to go to sea, and he was very, very passionate about it. And my most memorable moments were my grandfather Dawicki telling us stories about going around the world and going to some country and having some fascinating event happen. And he was a great storyteller, like that generation. And he started his career by coming to the United States from Poland on a ship and became fascinated with it at that moment. At 9 years old, he fell in love with that vessel that brought him to a new hope, a new America. And he really planted that seed, I assume, with my father, with my brothers, certainly, with myself, certainly. And I hope that I get to share some of that excitement with anybody else that wants to listen.
It's a very important history that we share on this program, and will continue to as you're tuned into a new radio show that truly talks about the history, culture, and maritime industry today and tomorrow, as it is linked to our home here on the South Coast. Maritime Matters with Eric Dawicki continues in just a moment. Welcome back to Maritime Matters with Eric Dawicki, president of the Northeast Maritime Institute. This is a brand new radio program that discusses the important and rich history, culture, and industry issues of today and tomorrow, linked to our own home here on the South Coast. And Eric, you had my full attention in the first segment of this wonderful new radio show, Maritime Matters, as we talked about some of the importance of history. And when I think of some of the great names that are related to this area, names from Warren Delano to, Paul Cuffey and Lewis Temple, there's so much history that we can talk about.
We really can, Phil. I think we could spend a year talking about maritime history here.
Yeah.
We are such a culturally rich community when it comes to maritime history. And it's just, it's fascinating. We spoke about on our show last week that, if you have time, go visit the Whaling Museum. Get exposed to your maritime traditions, your maritime history. The Whaling Museum is just one of the most fascinating museums I've ever seen around the world. But it's who we are. It's who our community is, in fact. So I think if we remind ourselves once in a while, I try to do it a couple times a year. Just go in and I've been doing this ever since I was a little boy, and I discover something new all the time. Here's a tidbit of history.
Yeah.
My home is 47 Union Street in Fairhaven. My mother's great uncle was a barrel cooper. He used to make the whale oil barrels. Excuse me.
Yeah.
Guess where that was located in Fairhaven? 47 Union Street,
you
Fairhaven.
Must be kidding.
Not the same property, but it was basically down on Union Wharf was 47 Union Street. Here I am. I live at 47 Union Street now. I did not know that. My father, who has since passed, took my son Morgan, by the way, who was named after the Charles W. Morgan, to the Whaling Museum. And they were looking around, and my father said, "Hey, Morgan, look up here." They had a Cooper's display. 47 Union Street, Gifford. My mother's maiden name is Gifford. So fascinating little tidbits of history that you can just walk through that Whaling Museum and find something new every single day. So folks, I really, truly recommend engage in your maritime history and take time out at the Whaling Museum. And they're not paying me to plug this, so
No,
I just believe truly in that mission.
I think the golden thread that brings together all the history of this area partly are some of the great people. I was mentioning the name Delano. Talk about a famous name, Delano. You were mentioning names yourself. We do have that golden thread that brings the quilt together, doesn't it?
Really does. When you think of the merchant shipping industry, when you really delve into the history of the United States, Warren Delano, who happened to be the grandfather of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, really descended from a long line of seafaring peoples. And, the funny part is Warren inevitably followed his ancestors' footsteps to become an apprentice at a Boston merchant bank and shipping firm.
Huh.
Banking and shipping were directly connected. And in fact, if you peel away the layers of the onion in the global banking industry, shipping is a critical aspect of how banks operate and marginalize risk. It's in investing in ship steel.
Fascinating.
So it's a very interesting thing. But anyway, Delano left the U.S. in 1833 to go work in China and establish himself in Canton. He replaced a fellow by the name of Samuel H. Russell of the Boston Tea Company, Russell and Company. Lived in China for 9 years, where he earned a position of Chief Operations Officer in Macau, Canton, and Hong Kong. That trade, in fact, opened up immense revenues to the United States that basically was monopolized by the British. And Russell and Company went in and established themselves, got their foot in, but Warren Delano really became a powerhouse. And when I say a powerhouse, he took over and really made things happen, and really became one of the richest men in the United States at the time. And who was he? He was a local Fairhavenite. And I'll tell you, he when we see blue and white China, that's a direct resultant factor of Warren Delano's China trade. You can see it in antique form, of course, and you can see it in blue and white China being produced and sold in any Macy's or Dillard's or whatever stores you have. And it's just a fascinating thing that this young guy from Fairhaven, who established himself in Fairhaven, created such a magnificent American merchant trade. I will have to let the cat out of the bag a little bit. We said we weren't going to talk about this, but I will talk about it. The reality is the Chinese had a closed opium trade that they facilitated. They didn't bring opium back to the United States, but it was shipped throughout Asia. And the clever part of what Warren Delano did is he used these ships to, in fact, offload this bad stuff, onload goods and services and things that we wanted to participate here in the West. And we were able to introduce all kinds of medicines, all kinds of culture, all kinds of silks, China, and it really opened up the concept of international trade, and he laid that platform.
How interesting. Folks, if you're just joining us, speaking of interesting, we have a real delight here in that we are launching Maritime Matters with Eric Dawicki. This is the second week that the president of the Northeast Maritime Institute is hosting this wonderful radio show about history, culture, and the maritime industry. And this was also about the same time that I guess whaling was starting to take hold back in those days, and how whaling has become just an integral part of our history. You were mentioning Moby Dick, a classic known all over the world, and thus we are very, very famous because of that.
I'll tell you, whaling put us on the map, in fact. New Bedford was, in fact, the richest city per capita in the world at actually 2 points, both the whaling industry and the textiles industry. But that directly related to our maritime history and culture as well. And that trade in the whaling industry really established itself as New Bedford becoming the prime hub for vessels to go around the world, catching whales, basically evolving the whale oil trade. Whale oil heated the houses and lit the houses of the world, created lubricants for the world. Really was a magnificent trade. Well, the problem with whale oil, maybe even like petroleum oil today, is eventually it disappears. So we did struggle with that a little bit, but in fact, the whaling industry did establish New Bedford, the South Coast, as a primary resource in getting back into that banking world. If you look at the most functional banks during those periods, they were downtown New Bedford. We have stories that evolved. Hetty Green. Here's a great story. A local kid done good as a result of the whaling industry. Henry Huddleston Rogers took cracking, of oil and refining of whale oil and brought it to the petroleum industry and became, to this day, still the 16th richest man in the history of the world.
Absolutely.
So the whaling industry really did establish itself as the primary function of our community, but really did recede out into other communities, both nationally and internationally, in a way that nobody ever saw coming.
Absolutely right. I think of names like Paul Cuffey, Lewis Temple, names that perhaps nobody would have known about had it not been for their great contribution to the maritime industry.
Well, here's the neat thing about our maritime history. When you look at diversity and in the most successful nations, the most successful communities, the most successful organizations are those organizations that embrace diversity. Diversity was first introduced by the introduction of multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic, and multiracial persons working on whale ships. They lived together, they ate together, they prayed together, they worked together, they laughed together, they read together, they wrote books together, they created art, industry, all together. These were people from every aspect of walking life around the world. New Bedford facilitated that. We are the first integrated industry in the world, in the history of the world. That tells you something. Now, talk about Lewis Temple. African American, invented probably the most unique harpoon in the world, the toggle harpoon. And I've got to tell you, that, in fact, revolutionized the industry.
Sure.
Now they could, stick a whale and grab it versus sticking it and hoping it would slow down, right? So you talk about Paul Cuffey, Cape Verdean captain. Wow, an African-American captain in a period when people from that culture, from that race, literally were working as slaves. New Bedford embraced that integration and that concept of diversity. And I think that was, in fact, where we led the world in the anti-slavery movement, as an anti-slavery hub. Let's face it, Frederick Douglass moved here, the most famous abolitionist in the history of our country.
Absolutely.
So we did something as a result of, if you look at the root cause of diversity and anti-slavery, you think about it, it really did come from our maritime trades. It's integrating of persons on those whale ships, working together, plying the seas together, earning a living together. And that's why I believe I came back home to raise my children in this area, to make sure they were exposed to that history and culture in order to further their pursuits when they get older.
Ladies and gentlemen, Eric Dawicki is not only enlightening, but he is enriching us, as his new radio show, Maritime Matters, is going to pay tribute to the important maritime history and culture and industry, jobs, and how they're linked to the South Coast today. Eric is the president of Northeast Maritime Institute, and as the president of this world-recognized institute, I'm sure that as you go around the globe, Eric, people will say, well, New London, Connecticut is the Coast Guard Academy's home, but you told me something that is quite fascinating.
Well, here's an exciting tidbit. The Coast Guard Academy was actually established in New Bedford.
Unbelievable.
Actually in 1876 as the School of Instruction for the Revenue Cutter Service. The Revenue Cutter Service was the original Coast Guard established by John Paul Jones. The funny part is, where did they stay? Anybody know that question out there? And I'm hearing the rumblings behind the airwaves here.
Yeah.
the Tabitha Inn, which was the hotel that Mark Twain talked Henry Huddleston Rogers into building in the center of Fairhaven, became the housing or dormitory space for the Coast Guard Academy cadets, or the students of the School of Instruction of the Revenue Cutter Service. That's pretty fascinating stuff, and we need to take that. And I this is something you might not know about me. I'm a lifetime trustee, former director of the Coast Guard Foundation, and I am going to make a big stink about New Bedford and Fairhaven not being recognized as the first academy in the United States.
Well, good for you.
We're going to make that a personal goal.
And why not? I think, as cars pass along 195, there ought to be some kind of signage that lets people know about this is a very historic, milestone here. Very important piece of history. And where was this little hotel in Fairhaven located?
It's on Center Street in Fairhaven.
Whereabouts?
About 2 blocks east of the town hall. So it's actually now called Our Lady's Haven, which is a rest home, a nursing home.
Yeah. Very, very interesting how we learn. Every time that we talk about local history, there's always something to learn. And I didn't know that. Wow. We're going to have lots of these moments in the future, folks, as we talk about today, history and how it's very important and intricately woven into what this radio program is going to accomplish. And, you talked about, Eric, everything from fishing and whaling and whatnot, but then you did touch upon the fact that New Bedford also became a very wealthy port city because of textiles.
I'll tell you, Phil, the textiles industry was critical to the development of New Bedford. Not only the development of New Bedford, but it became a spirited community that attracted so many foreigners to immigrate to the United States. We literally brought peoples in from, France, Belgium, England, Poland, Portuguese. Name the nationality, and they lived here. And New Bedford became the melting pot. If you really look at the concept of the melting pot, you looked at neighborhoods, multi-ethnic neighborhoods, you could get any type of food you wanted. And that's kind of the fascinating approach to who we were and who we are and who we can become, because, in fact, we still hold on tightly to our ethnic roots. I know when somebody asks me, where are you from? I said, I'm Polish-American, or I never talk about my English roots because people already assume that. But the reality is we identify ourselves as Portuguese, as Polish, as German, as French. And that's a fascinating aspect of how this South Coast area evolved. And the textiles industry provided the greatest influx of immigrants to New Bedford. We worked hard, we produced textiles, and they all left ships from the port of New Bedford. And they were distributed throughout the world, bringing clothing to the world. And that's a fascinating aspect of how goods and services are delivered. And in fact, today, ironically, the opposite happens. Now we receive goods and services. We are a consumer nation. But it's still the same trade routes, it's still the same trade lanes, and in fact, New Bedford is becoming more and more of an important hub for redistribution of goods, foods, in fact, for the rest of the world to participate in.
And keeping it just for a moment in the modern day, cargo shipping is really starting to pick up, and is actually increasing in this area. Would you agree?
It really is. There's nothing more exciting for me than I walk up to my office. I have this wonderful office on top of the 32 Washington Street building at Northeast Maritime Institute, where my office is an old bell tower. And I get a 360-degree view, and I look out over New Bedford Harbor, and I see those cargo ships. It just brings me right back to being a little boy, seeing those big boats come in, sometimes picking my dad up at the dock, getting off one of those boats, and literally knowing that we are rebirthing ourselves as a maritime hub and as a maritime community. And I applaud everybody who has made an effort to do that.
Eric, when we come back, speaking of rebirthing ourselves, perhaps we can talk about how history and retraining today's mariner is a very important topic for us to discuss, plus continuing with the rich history of the port of New Bedford and Fairhaven on this brand new radio show we hope you'll enjoy and make a habit of tuning into regularly. Maritime Matters with Eric Dawicki. Welcome back to Maritime Matters with Eric Dawicki, president of the Northeast Maritime Institute, a new radio program on the new 1420 that really discusses the rich maritime history, our culture, and the industry in general, but specifically how it relates to our own home right here, from West Island Tower to Cape Cod, you might say. And speaking of Cape Cod, the canal, very, very important technological feature, isn't the Cape Cod Canal, Eric?
Phil, it really is. You know, when you think of the fact that the canal was really started as an estuary or a river that meandered between what we call the mainland and the Cape, to become the widest canal found on Earth today.
Wow.
It is pretty significant. We actually have 14,000 users per year going through the Cape Cod Canal. The fact is that the canal, the idea of the canal, really started with Miles Standish back in 1623, when
Really?
he saw it as a need to avoid disaster of going around P-Town or Provincetown, to circumnavigate the region and connect the New England trades with the rest of the East Coast of the United States. General George Washington in 1776 wanted it developed as a canal based on its importance, its military importance, and again to avoid the hundreds of vessels that basically went aground off the treacherous shoals of Cape Cod.
Why was that?
Well, you have shifting and meandering sands. You know, when you look at Cape Cod, it's a sandy region, and those sands, that's easy to move around and shift with storms, constantly shifting. If you recall, just a few years back, you know, in Truro, we were losing lots of waterfront property.
Yes.
But where does that waterfront property go? It goes out to sea and creates little sandbars and what I call collectors of boats. People run aground and get in trouble. So this was clearly evident as far back as 1776, when Washington really did demand that we put this concept, make it a priority to the development of the United States and U.S. trade and safe passage of vessels.
And when you think of Cape Cod, the canal itself, you've mentioned some very strategic, important features of it, but tell us about some of the opportunities it also opened up.
Well, it opened up the fact that you could save time of moving a vessel from, say, Boston down to the East Coast. You're basically cutting a day off of travel. You know, time is money, especially in the maritime trades. The contracts are based on day rates, and day rates are very expensive, and even were way back when. So if you could shave a day off transportation, the charterers or the cargo owners could save a lot of money, get their goods and services distributed much faster and much more efficiently and much more cost effectively. The canal was the primary promulgator of safe and efficient shipping from the East Coast that started up in New England.
It is known all around the world. You know, the moment you cross the bridges over that canal into Cape Cod, I mean, it's an iconic image that people all around the world and a lot of presidents have made popular. As we take a look at that, was it last year that the canal celebrated, was it 100 years, Eric? Or
100-year anniversary.
Yeah.
It was completed in 1914. And you know, I guess the canal is never completed because you constantly have to dredge it. But
why is that?
Well, the shifting sands, you know, debris coming in, silt. And I think it's just, you know, the good news about America is even though we sometimes fail on our infrastructure, we do keep it up pretty well.
Absolutely. I guess it was very important also during World War II and other, you know, historic times in American history.
It sure did. You know, you had the German U-boats sitting outside on George's banks outside of the Nantucket Sound. They were even in Buzzards Bay, quite frankly, and the canal allowed safe passage of vessels to avoid contact with those German U-boats.
Yep. You know, the history of our maritime industry is so very important. And this radio program is actually going to not only highlight the importance of the history and the culture and the industry itself, ladies and gentlemen, but it's also going to remind us that it puts food on our table. It's such a critically important issue here, Eric, and I know you're going to have a great time hosting this new radio program.
I couldn't be more excited. You know, for me, it's about jobs, and I truly believe I've been blessed with employment in this industry and watched so many of my neighbors and their families and their fathers and grandfathers and uncles work in this industry. It's just a fascinating industry, but it doesn't stop, Phil, with just going on a boat. I mean, ships are ships, and they're fascinating, and every kid loves to play with a toy boat. But the realities are that there are so many ancillary industries that apply to the maritime sector. And what I hope to do is excite our community to take a leadership role back in the maritime industry and move it forward and really reestablish ourselves as a vital economic driver to the United States and other nations, but making the South Coast, New Bedford, Fairhaven Harbor, the hub of the future maritime industry globally.
How fascinating. And when you say Fairhaven, I want to end on the note of was there a tower on West Island that used to look as far as perhaps Cape Cod? Was there a tower there at one time?
Still is.
Still
is in existence. There is a U-boat spy tower on West Island. It's a fascinating building. It's pretty much a cement building now, but I can only imagine how fun it was being out there and with all the flora and the fauna. But yeah, it was built for World War II and served a significant purpose.
This is just an indication of some of the interesting facts you'll be hearing over the months to come with this brand new radio program called Maritime Matters with Eric Dawicki, a program that we're honored to have on our airwaves, but also one that I know you will find, ladies and gentlemen, very interesting, with the president of the Northeast Maritime Institute. Eric, let me leave the last word to you.
South Coast, let's get ready to reinvigorate our maritime history, our maritime roots, and move into the future.
We'll see you next time on Maritime Matters with Eric Dawicki. 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 With Eric Dawicki.